Tonight, we return to a man walking through smoke. The temple is behind him. The fires are still working in the specific and patient way that fires work when they have found what they came for, consuming what remains with the indifferent quality of something that has no opinion about the significance of what it is consuming. The man walking away from it is not celebrating, and not explaining himself, and not organizing his face into the expression that the situation seems to require, because the situation is too large for expression, is the kind of thing that arrives before the face has finished deciding what to do with it, and that leaves the face for a while simply present, simply carrying the person through the smoke toward whatever the smoke opens into. His name is Yasuke, and the world he lived in is ash, not metaphorically, literally. The court at Azuchi, the circle of power, the lord who laughed and gave him a name and a sword and a room near his own quarters, and the specific and unprecedented quality of being seen rather than categorized. The life that was being built inside all of this, the life that had no prior model and no tradition to follow, and that was finding its shape day by day in the specific and unrepeatable way that unprecedented lives find their shape, which is by living forward into the space that the precedent has not yet filled. All of it is behind him now, in the most complete and irreversible sense. Behind him the way the island was behind Musashi on the boat across the strait, except that Musashi on the boat had won, and Yasuke, walking through the smoke, has survived. And surviving and winning are not the same thing, are not even close to the same thing on the morning after the night that Honnoji burned. Tonight we follow him into the silence, into the weeks and the months after the temple, into the Jesuit residence and the question of what comes next that the Jesuit residents cannot answer, into the records that were keeping careful track of him and that stop with the specific and absolute quality of a door closing at exactly the moment when the story needs them most. We will follow the record as far as the record goes, and then we will sit with what the record leaves, which is not nothing, is not the comfortable emptiness of a question that was never worth asking, but the specific and weighted silence of a question that matters enormously, and that the surviving evidence declines to answer. My name is Henry, and this is Boring Japanese History. If part 1 carried you through the harbour and the castle and the circle of power and the burning temple, if the smoke and the sword and the name settled something in you, the way that honest things settle something even when they are heavy, then consider subscribing. There are more lives coming, more rooms and more roads, and more people who walked through history in ways that the history books only partially preserved, and that deserve the specific and careful attention that partial preservation requires. And tonight, we finish one of the most extraordinary and most honestly incomplete of those lives. But for now, close your eyes. Let your shoulders find the floor. Let the smoke come to you, not the thick and choking smoke of the fire at its height, but the smoke of the morning after, the thin and drifting smoke of a fire that has finished its work and is releasing what remains into the air above the city with the specific and weightless quality of something that is neither the thing it was nor entirely gone, that exists now in the form of dispersal, of particles moving outward through the morning air of Kyoto in the summer of 1582, carrying within them the specific and irreducible residue of what they used to be. There is a man in a room in the Jesuit residence. The room is quieter than any room he has occupied since the ship came into Sakai harbor, quieter than the room near the Lord's quarters at Azuchi, where the sounds of the court were always present in the background, even in the deepest hours of the night. Quieter than the roads and the camps and the various locations that the life in Nobunaga's service required him to occupy across the months and years of that service. The room is the specific and provisional quiet of a place that is holding someone who does not quite belong there, that is providing shelter in the way that places provide shelter to people who are between the life they had and the life they are going to have, in the specific and suspended quality of the in-between that has no name yet, because the name requires knowing where the in-between is going. And this in-between does not yet know where it is going. He is 30 years old, or close enough to 30 that the difference does not matter. He has crossed an ocean and walked into the most powerful court in Japan, and been given a name and a sword and a proximity to power that no foreigner had been given before. He has stood in the burning temple and fought for the man who gave him all of these things, and walked out of the smoke carrying the last thing the man gave him. And now he is in a room in a Jesuit residence in a city that is reorganizing itself around the new fact of what happened in the temple. And the reorganization has no category for him, and the record that has been tracking him with the specific and attentive quality of the Jesuit correspondence since the ship came into Sakai harbor is about to go quiet. The silence is coming. Not yet. There are still a few weeks of record, a few more entries in the accounts, a few more facts before the facts stop. But the silence is already present in the quality of those final weeks, already audible in the specific and narrowing quality of what the accounts have to say. The way that the approach of an ending is sometimes present in the texture of what precedes it, even before the ending has arrived. We are going to follow him into the silence, and then we are going to sit with it, because the silence of the historical record is not the same as the silence of a life that stopped. It is the silence of a record that lost track, and those are not the same thing, and the difference matters. Shh. We begin. But first, one more thing about this man. In the weeks after Honnoji, the Jesuit accounts describe him with a word that does not appear in any of their earlier descriptions. They call him sad. We will find out what that means, and what it cost, and what came after. The Jesuit residence in Kyoto, in the summer of 1582, is a place that is doing what institutions do when the world around them has just changed in ways that the institution did not anticipate and cannot yet fully assess. Which is to say, it is continuing, maintaining the specific and organizational momentum of its daily functions, with the slightly dazed quality of a body that keeps moving after the mind has been struck, that performs the motions of its ordinary life because the motions are available, and the alternative, which is to stop and fully absorb what has happened, is not yet something the institution is ready to do. The Jesuits in Japan in 1582 are in a specific and precarious position that the night of Honnoji has made more specific and more precarious, because the position they occupied was organized to a significant degree around their relationship to Nobunaga, around the access and the protection and the specific quality of official tolerance that his interest in the foreign and the unconventional had provided to the mission in a country where official tolerance for foreign religious institutions was not a permanent or guaranteed condition, but a contingent one, dependent on the goodwill of the people in power, and therefore as subject to change as the people in power were subject to change. The people in power have changed. Valignano is not in Japan at this moment, has left the country before the night of Honnoji on the ecclesiastical business that his position requires him to conduct across the various locations where the Jesuit mission operates. And his absence from Japan at this specific moment is one of the small and contingent facts of the story that the story would be different without. Because Valignano's presence would have meant a different quality of institutional response to the situation that the night of Honnoji has produced, a more deliberate and more strategically organized response, organized around the specific and practical intelligence of a man who had been thinking carefully about the Jesuit mission's position in Japan for years, and who understood better than almost anyone the specific and various ways in which that position was vulnerable. The Jesuits who are present receive Yasuke with the quality that institutions bring to unexpected arrivals in moments of institutional crisis, which is to say, with the specific and slightly overwhelmed quality of people who are managing more than their normal complement of significant things simultaneously, and who are adding the new significant thing to the management without being entirely sure how to manage it or what managing it well would look like. He is given the room. He is provided with the basic conditions of shelter and sustenance that the institution's function as a place of residence makes available. He is present in the building in the specific and suspended quality of a person who has arrived somewhere that is not a destination, but a pause. Not the place the life is going, but the place the life is resting, while the question of where it is going is still being determined. The accounts that describe him in the Jesuit residence in the weeks after Honnoji describe a person in the specific condition that the accounts describe with the word that the P2 introduction promised to return to. They call him sad. The word appears in the Jesuit correspondence with the specific and unelaborated quality of a detail that the writer found worth noting, but did not find worth explaining, which is itself informative, because the things that writers find worth noting, but not worth explaining, are the things that they assume their readers will understand without explanation, the things that are legible within the shared framework of the writer and the reader, without the addition of context. The sadness is legible. The writer assumes the reader will understand why a man in Yasuke's situation in the weeks after Honnoji would be sad without being told why. And the assumption is correct, because the why is not complicated, is not the product of some interior complexity that requires unpacking, is simply the direct and honest response of a person who has lost the thing that the life was organized around, and who is in the specific and early stage of that loss, where the loss is still too present and too large to have been converted into anything other than what it is. The city outside the Jesuit residence is moving through its own version of the same process, the specific and collective process of absorbing a loss so large and so sudden that the absorption cannot happen quickly, that requires the kind of time that large things require, when the largeness is not the largeness of a single event, but the largeness of a reorganization, of a world that was pointed in one direction, now pointing in a different direction, and the people who lived in the world that was pointed in the first direction needing to understand what the new direction means for the specific and various conditions of their own lives. Akechi Mitsuhide survives the night of Honnoji by approximately 13 days. This is one of the facts about the aftermath of the night that the history preserves with a clarity and a completeness that the fate of Yasuke does not receive. The specific and well-documented fact of Mitsuhide's defeat at the Battle of Yamazaki by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who moved his forces from the Western campaign with a speed that Mitsuhide did not anticipate, and that converted the 13 days between Honnoji and Yamazaki into something that history remembers as the 13-day shogunate, the specific and almost darkly comic brevity of a man's grasp on the power he seized at the cost of everything and held for less than 2 weeks before it was taken from him in turn. The world that Honnoji ended is being replaced. Not immediately, not with the clean and decisive quality of a replacement that happens all at once, but gradually and then completely, in the specific and various ways that the replacements of political orders happen, through the accumulation of military outcomes and political negotiations, and the shifting of allegiances, and the specific and ruthless logic of a situation in which the people who are most capable of seizing what Nobunaga's death has made available are in the process of doing so, and the people who are least capable are in the process of finding out what the least capable position means in a world where the most capable are not constrained by the previous order's rules, because the previous order no longer exists. Hideyoshi is the most capable. He will eventually become what Nobunaga was moving toward becoming, will complete in his own way and by his own methods the unification that Nobunaga began and that Honnoji interrupted, will build from the ruins of the world that burned in the temple, a new world that is different from the world Nobunaga was building, in the ways that the different person building it makes it different, which is to say, in the ways that matter most, in the specific and foundational ways of what the new order values and what it fears, and what it is willing to do to the things it fears. Yasuke is in the Jesuit residence while all of this is happening, in the specific and suspended quality of a person whose situation is being determined by forces that are not organized around him, and that do not have a category for him in the new organization of things they are producing, that are making decisions about the shape of the world without including in those decisions any particular consideration of what the new shape means for one specific and unprecedented man in a room in a Jesuit building in Kyoto. He is, in the most practical sense, outside the reorganization, not protected by it, not threatened by it in any direct or organized way, simply not included in it, not present in the categories that the reorganization is using to sort the people and the things and the relationships of the old order into the configurations that the new order requires. The sword that Nobunaga gave him is gone, or is no longer with him, the accounts suggesting, without clearly stating, that the sword was taken at the time of his capture outside the burning temple. that the specific and consequential object that represented in its physical and material form everything that the relationship between Yasuke and Nobunaga had built is no longer present as a physical fact in the world, exists now only as a memory and a record, and the specific and permanent quality of a thing that was real and is no longer present in the form in which it was real. The gate of the Jesuit residence is between him and the reorganizing world, and on the other side of the gate, the reorganization continues without him. The last clear entry in the Jesuit accounts that places Yasuke in a specific location, doing a specific thing, is an entry from the weeks immediately following Honnoji. An entry that describes him in the Jesuit residence with the specific and unelaborated quality of a writer recording a present fact, rather than narrating a developing story. Recording where he is, and what the general quality of his situation is, without providing the kind of forward-looking context that would indicate where the writer expects the situation to go. After this entry, the entries stop. Not with the dramatic quality of an ending that announces itself, not with the specific and conclusive quality of a final record that knows it is a final record and organizes itself accordingly, but with the specific and unremarkable quality of a series of entries that simply do not continue, that end not because something happened to end them, but because the tracking stopped, because the specific and attentive quality of the Jesuit correspondence that had been following Yasuke since the ship came into Sakai harbor found, at some point in the weeks and months after Honnoji, that the thing it had been tracking was no longer present in a way that the tracking could follow. He disappears from the record. This phrase, which is the phrase that everyone who has written about Yasuke eventually arrives at, is worth examining with some care, because the phrase does two things simultaneously, one of which is accurate, and one of which requires the specific and careful qualification that honesty about historical evidence requires. The accurate thing the phrase does is describe what happens to the documentary record, which is that the documentary record stops providing information about where Yasuke is and what he is doing, and what the quality of his situation is. The thing that requires qualification is the implication that the disappearance from the record is the same as a disappearance from the world, that the man and the documentation of the man end at the same moment and in the same way. They do not. The record ends. The man continues, or continued, for some period of time after the record ends, in the specific and undocumented quality of a life that the documentary apparatus of the period was no longer tracking, that was happening in the spaces between the records rather than in the records themselves, that was real in the way that all lives are real, regardless of whether anyone with access to paper and ink and the specific and consequential function of record keeping was present to note the reality. Why does the record stop? This is the question that the silence raises, and the question has multiple answers that are not mutually exclusive, that can all be simultaneously true in the specific and various ways that historical silences are produced not by single causes, but by the accumulation of conditions that together make the continuation of the record less likely than its cessation. The Jesuit mission in Japan is in a more precarious position after Honnoji than before it, is no longer operating under the specific quality of official tolerance that Nobunaga's interest provided, is in the process of assessing the new political landscape and the new political landscape's relationship to foreign religious institutions with the specific and anxious quality of an institution that knows its presence in the country is contingent, and that the contingency has just become more visible and less comfortable than it was before the temple burned. The correspondence that the mission produces in this period is organized around the mission's own concerns, around the specific and pressing questions of its own survival, and its own relationship to the new order that is assembling itself from the ruins of the old one. And Yasuke is not one of the mission's concerns, in the way that he was one of the mission's concerns when his relationship to Nobunaga made him relevant to the mission's strategic position. He was relevant when he was connected to power. The connection is gone, and with the connection, the relevance. There is a specific and important difference between a history that records everything and a history that records what the people doing the recording found worth recording. And the history of Japan in this period is entirely the second kind. Which is to say, it is the kind of history that all history is. The kind that is organized around the specific and various interests and concerns and frameworks of the people who were in a position to create records, and who created records organized around what mattered to them, rather than around what would matter to the people reading those records 500 years later. What mattered to the Jesuits was the Jesuit mission, the correspondence they produced, the letters and the reports and the accounts that constitute the primary source for most of what we know about Yasuke, was produced in the service of that mission, was written by people whose function was to inform the institutional hierarchy of the mission about the state of the mission's work and the conditions under which the work was being conducted. Yasuke appears in this correspondence when and because his presence is relevant to the mission's work and its conditions, when his relationship to Nobunaga makes him a factor in the mission's strategic situation, when his extraordinary reception in Japan provides evidence that the records want to preserve about the Japanese response to the foreign and the Christian, and the specific qualities of the people and the world that the mission represents. When he is no longer relevant to these concerns, the correspondence stops tracking him. This is not negligence, and it is not indifference in the moral sense, is not the product of a failure to understand that the life of the person being tracked has a value that extends beyond the person's relevance to the institution doing the tracking. It is simply the specific and honest way that institutional records work, the way that the organizational logic of record keeping organizes the record around the institution's concerns, rather than around the concerns of the people the institution encounters, even when those people are extraordinary, even when the lives they are living are the kinds of lives that the people 500 years later would very much like to know more about. The Japanese records are not more helpful. The Japanese documentary apparatus of this period is organized around the concerns of the Japanese political and military world, around the lords and the battles and the decisions and the alliances and the specific and consequential movements of power that constitute the primary subject matter of the history that the period's record keepers found worth preserving. A foreigner in a lord's service is not, within this framework, a primary subject, is not the kind of person that the documentary apparatus is organized around tracking, with the specific and sustained attention that would have produced the record that would allow the question of what happened to Yasuke to be answered clearly. He falls between the records, not because his life was not worth recording, not because what happened to him was not significant, not because the question of where he went and what he became is not worth asking, but because the records were not organized around him, were organized around the things that the people making the records found significant. And a man who was extraordinary by any honest measure was not, within the specific and limited frameworks of the available records, the kind of extraordinary that those frameworks were built to preserve. The silence is not a judgment. It is a gap. And gaps are not the same as endings. He leaves the Jesuit residence at some point. This much can be inferred from the shape of the evidence, even when the evidence itself does not provide the specific and datable fact of when the leaving happened and where the leaving went. Inferred from the simple and honest recognition that the Jesuit residence was not a place that a person in Yasuke's situation would have remained indefinitely. That the specific and suspended quality of his presence there was the quality of a pause rather than a resolution, of a moment between the life that had ended and the life that was going to begin, rather than a destination that the ending had produced. The gate of the Jesuit residence opens and closes many times in the weeks and months after Honnoji, receiving and releasing the various people whose business with the institution requires them to pass through it. And at some point among these openings and closings, there is the one that lets Yasuke out into the streets of a Kyoto that is no longer the Kyoto he walked through in the procession of the most powerful lord in Japan. That is the Kyoto of the aftermath, the city in the process of understanding what it has become, and what the becoming means for the specific and various conditions of the lives being lived within it. He walks into this city. The accounts do not follow him. The record that began on the docks of Sakai in 1579, that tracked him through the crowd and the castle and the circle of power and the burning temple, with the specific and attentive quality of correspondence organized around the significance of what it was witnessing, ends here, at the gate, with the specific and final quality of a document that has reached the limit of what it can see from the position it was written from. Beyond the gate, the life continues. We know this in the way we know things that the evidence supports, without the evidence fully proving. In the way that reasonable inference from available facts produces conclusions that are not certain, but are more honest than the alternative, which is the conclusion that the life ended when the record ended, that the man and the documentation of the man are the same thing, and that the cessation of the one is the cessation of the other. He was perhaps 30 years old when the record closes. 30 years old is not old. It is the specific age at which a life that has already been extraordinary has decades ahead of it in which to continue being various and real and full of the specific and undocumented quality of experience that happens in the spaces between the records, that is lived rather than archived, that accumulates in the body and the memory and the specific and irreducible interiority of a person, rather than in the correspondence of the institution that was tracking him for reasons of its own. The gate closes. The street outside it is the street of a city in summer, hot and various, and full of the specific and ordinary texture of lives being lived in the aftermath of something large. People moving through the space between where they were and where they are going, with the specific and unremarked quality of people who are doing what people do when the world has changed around them, which is to say, continuing, finding the next thing, moving forward in the only direction that moving is possible, which is forward. He moves into this. The city receives him the way cities receive everyone who moves through them without documentation, which is to say, without record, which is to say, with the specific and complete indifference of a space that is too large and too various to track every person within it, and that has always been full of lives that were real and consequential and entirely unrecorded, that happened in the gaps of the documentary apparatus, with the same quality of reality as the lives that the apparatus preserved, the same specific and irreducible weight of a person being present in the world and moving through it and being changed by it and changing it in ways too small or too private or too outside the concerns of the record keepers to have been noted. The record is silent. The life was not. Shh. Just breathe. The gate is behind you. The city is ahead, hot and various, and full of the specific and ordinary texture of a summer morning in a place that is still becoming what it is going to be. And somewhere in it, a man is walking, undocumented, alive, moving forward in the only direction that moving is possible. Good night. There is a specific kind of attention that historians bring to the edges of what the evidence says, to the boundary between the documented and the undocumented, between the fact that the record provides and the inference that the record makes possible but does not make explicit. And this attention is different from the attention that the evidence's center requires, is more careful and more self-aware and more honest about its own limitations. Because the center of the evidence is the place where the record speaks clearly enough that the historian's primary job is to listen and report. And the edge of the evidence is the place where the historian's own judgment and the historian's own framework begin to participate in the construction of what the evidence means, where the distance between what the record says and what the historian concludes from the record is large enough to require acknowledgement rather than concealment. The evidence for Yasuke's life is almost entirely edge. This is the specific and honest condition of the historical record that surrounds him, the condition that makes him one of the most written about and most debated figures in the history of the period, and simultaneously one of the least known. The condition that makes every claim about him more tentative than claims about the people the record tracked more completely, more dependent on the specific and various judgments that historians and writers and the people who tell his story make about what the available fragments mean and what the gaps between the fragments contain. The primary sources are few, and they are not neutral. This is the second condition of the evidence, the condition that compounds the first, because a few neutral sources would be better than a few non-neutral sources in the specific and important way that evidence is better when the people producing it are not simultaneously participants in the events they are describing and members of institutions with specific and consequential interests in how those events are understood. The Jesuit correspondence that constitutes the majority of the surviving evidence about Yasuke was produced by people who were members of the Jesuit mission, who were writing in the service of the mission's institutional interests, who were describing the world around them through the specific and particular lens of a European Catholic institution in 16th century Japan, trying to establish itself in a country whose culture and religion and political structure were entirely outside the categories that the institution's tradition had developed for understanding the world. They were trying to do something in Japan, and the something they were trying to do shaped what they noticed, and what they wrote down, and what they emphasized, and what they left out. And the specific quality of the framework through which all of these decisions were made. Luis Frois is the most important of these writers for the Yasuke story. The Jesuit priest whose accounts of Japan in the late 16th century are among the most detailed and most frequently cited sources for the period. The man whose specific and various observations about Japanese culture and the events of Nobunaga's court, and the particular and extraordinary things that happened in Japan during the years he was present to observe them, constitute the closest thing the historical record has to a sustained and attentive witness to the world that Yasuke moved through. He noticed Yasuke. He wrote about him. What he wrote is worth reading with the specific and careful attention that sources require when the source and the subject are not from the same world, and the source's framework for understanding what it is observing is organized around concerns that are not the same as the concerns the subject would have had about their own life. Frois writes about Yasuke's arrival in Japan with the specific quality of a writer who understands that he is describing something extraordinary, and who wants the people reading his account, the administrators and the priests in Goa and Rome, who are the primary audience for the Jesuit correspondence, to understand the extraordinariness, without the description becoming the kind of spectacle that would distract from the institutional purpose the correspondence is meant to serve. The description he produces is careful, and it is detailed, and it is, within the limits of what the framework available to him allows it to be, honest. He describes the crowd at Sakai with the specific and attentive quality of a man who was present, and who understood that the scale of the response was significant, not merely as a curiosity, but as evidence of something about Japan, and about the Japanese response to the foreign that the mission needed to understand if it was going to navigate the Japanese world, with the specific and practical intelligence that navigation of a foreign world requires. He describes Nobunaga's response with the quality of a man who understood that the relationship between Nobunaga and Yasuke had implications for the mission's own relationship to Nobunaga. That the Lord's fascination with the extraordinary foreigner was a version of the same fascination that the mission was trying to cultivate and sustain in relation to itself and its own extraordinary foreignness. The descriptions are useful. They are also shaped. They are shaped by the specific and various ways that a European Catholic priest in 16th century Japan sees and describes a man of African origin who has arrived in Japan in the company of the Jesuit mission and who is now moving in the immediate attendance of the most powerful lord in the country. The framework that Frois brings to this observation is not a neutral framework, is not the framework of a person who has no prior categories for the person they are observing, and who is therefore forced to construct their understanding of the person entirely from direct observation. It is a framework that has categories, specific and various categories, for Africans and for foreigners, and for people who are not European and not Christian, and not organized within the specific and hierarchical structure of the world that the framework was built to describe and navigate. These categories are not always kind. This is the thing about the primary sources for Yasuke's life that the people who tell his story must hold without flinching. The thing that the honesty of historical engagement requires acknowledging rather than minimizing or explaining away. The thing that is true about the sources in the specific and uncomfortable way that true things about historical sources are true. Which is to say, regardless of whether the acknowledgement is comfortable for the people making it, or for the people whose history the sources are being used to tell. The Jesuit writers who describe Yasuke describe him through a framework that was not built to see him clearly, that was built to see the world through the specific and various lenses of a European institution in the 16th century. And the seeing that this framework produces is real, and it is detailed, and it is the closest thing we have to a sustained witness. And it is also partial, and shaped, and organized around concerns that were not his concerns, and that sometimes produce in the description a quality that is something less than the full and honest recognition of another person's complete humanity. We read the sources knowing this. We read them anyway, because the partial and shaped witness is still a witness, and the witness is still the closest thing we have to the thing itself. The specific details that Frois and the other Jesuit writers preserve about Yasuke are worth examining individually, because the individual details are where the evidence is most concrete and most useful, and also where the framework most visibly shapes what is preserved and how it is preserved, where the gap between the source and the subject is most legible to the reader who is paying the specific and careful attention that this kind of reading requires. The detail of the crowd at Sakai is preserved with a specificity that suggests the writer understood its evidential value, understood that the scale of the Japanese response to Yasuke's arrival was data, was information about Japan, and about the Japanese relationship to the foreign and the extraordinary, that the mission needed, and that the detail therefore deserved the specific and careful preservation that useful data receives from writers who understand what they are preserving. The detail of Nobunaga's examination is preserved with the same quality. The specific and practical fact of the scrubbing and its result treated as evidence of Nobunaga's empirical temperament, which is to say as evidence about Nobunaga rather than about Yasuke, as a window into the Lord's character and his specific and unusual relationship to the foreign and the unknown, rather than as a description of something that happened to a person and that the person experienced from the inside. The detail of the sword and the room and the naming is preserved with the quality of institutional significance, the quality of a writer noting facts that are relevant to the mission's assessment of Yasuke's position in the court, and therefore relevant to the mission's own assessment of its own position in relation to the court, and to the Lord who gave the sword, and the room, and the name. The significance of these details for the mission is the significance of access, of the specific and consequential question of who has proximity to the Lord, and what the proximity means for the various people and institutions that are trying to cultivate and maintain their own proximity. And the detail of the sadness after Honnoji is preserved with the quality that personal observations receive from writers who include them because they are real and present and undeniable, rather than because they are institutionally significant. The quality of a fact that has found its way into the correspondence, not because it serves the institutional purpose, but because it was there, because the writer saw it, or was told it by someone who saw it, and because the specific and human reality of it was strong enough to make its way into the record, despite the fact that the record was not organized around the specific and human reality of Yasuke's experience. The sadness is the most honest detail. It is the detail that is least shaped by the framework, least organized around the institutional concerns that organize the other details. Most directly the record of a person, rather than the record of an institution's encounter with a person. And it is the shortest detail, the briefest and least elaborated of the significant details in the surviving record. The detail that receives the least space in the accounts, despite being for the purpose of understanding what Yasuke's life in Japan was, and what it cost him, and what the loss of Nobunaga meant at the level of the person, rather than the level of the institution, the most important detail of all. The record gives us the extraordinary facts of the life, and almost none of the interior. The extraordinary facts are real, and they are significant, and they deserve the attention they receive. And the interior is the thing that the extraordinary facts were organized around. The thing that was present in every moment of the life that the extraordinary facts describe. The thing that the framework of the sources was not built to see, and therefore did not see, and therefore did not preserve. It is gone, not because it was not there, but because no one with paper and ink was looking for it. The question of what Yasuke's origins were is one of the questions that the historical record raises and does not answer, or does not answer with the specificity that the question seems to deserve, that provides enough fragments of information to generate multiple hypotheses, without providing enough to confirm any single one of them with the kind of certainty that closes a question, rather than simply making it more precisely defined. He came from Africa. This much the sources establish, with enough consistency and enough convergence across multiple independent accounts to constitute something close to a fact, rather than simply a hypothesis. The specific geographical origin being the thing about which the sources are most agreed and most specific, even when the specific country or region within Africa is not something the sources address with the precision that the question of specific origin requires. The hypothesis that has received the most attention in recent scholarship places his origin in the region of present-day Mozambique, connects his presence in Japan to the specific and documented patterns of the Portuguese trading network in the Indian Ocean that linked East Africa to Goa to Japan, through the specific and consequential mechanism of the Portuguese merchant and missionary ships that were the primary vectors of European and African presence in Japan in this period. This hypothesis has the specific and useful quality of connecting Yasuke to a documented pattern of movement, rather than treating his presence in Japan as an isolated and inexplicable anomaly, of situating his arrival within the specific and historical reality of the Portuguese oceanic network that was, in the late 16th century, doing exactly the kind of thing that would have produced exactly the kind of person, in exactly the kind of situation that the sources describe. Other hypotheses exist. The record is not specific enough to rule them out, and the not ruling out of alternative hypotheses is not a failure of the scholarship, but the honest condition of evidence that does not provide the specificity that definitive conclusions require. He may have been from a different part of Africa. He may have had a background that the Mozambique hypothesis does not fully account for. He may have been in situations before Japan that shaped him in ways that the record does not preserve, but that were present in the quality of bearing and capability, and the specific and grounded equanimity that the sources consistently describe. We do not know. This not knowing is the honest condition of the historical engagement with Yasuke, and the honest condition deserves to be stated clearly, rather than obscured by the confident specificity that the story sometimes acquires when it is told by people who find the not knowing uncomfortable, or who believe that the story requires a more definitive foundation than the evidence actually provides. The boundary between the historical Yasuke and the legendary Yasuke runs through the not knowing. On one side of the boundary is what the sources actually say, which is significant and extraordinary and worth preserving and telling with the care that significant and extraordinary things deserve. On the other side is what the sources do not say, what the gaps contain, what the silence means, what the life was in the spaces between the documented moments that constitute the skeleton of the story. Both sides of the boundary are real. Both deserve the specific and careful attention that honest engagement with a life this unusual requires. The legend that has grown around Yasuke in the centuries since the records went quiet is a specific and interesting phenomenon. Interesting not only for what it tells us about him, but for what it tells us about the people who built the legend, and the specific and various needs that the legend serves for the people who tell it and the people who receive it. The legend is large now, larger than it has been at any point since the 17th century, larger than it has been since the records themselves were current, and the people who had known him were still alive to provide the specific and living correction to the exaggerations that legends accumulate the way surfaces accumulate dust, gradually and without intention, and in direct proportion to the time elapsed since anyone was close enough to the original to wipe the accumulation away. The novels and the films and the games and the animated series and the various and proliferating cultural productions that have taken Yasuke as their subject in the decades since he re-entered the popular imagination through the specific and various channels of modern media constitute a body of work that is worth examining with the same quality of attention that the primary sources deserve, which is the attention that asks what the work is doing and whose concerns it is organized around, and what it reveals about the people who made it and the audience who receives it, as much as what it reveals about the person it claims to be about. Some of this work is honest about what it is. It presents itself as fiction, as the imaginative engagement with a historical figure whose documented life provides a foundation, and whose undocumented life provides the space that the imagination requires to produce the specific and various elaborations that fiction elaborates from historical foundations. This work is doing what fiction has always done with historical figures, which is to use the documented reality as an anchor, and the undocumented spaces as an invitation. And the doing of this is legitimate and valuable, and capable of producing things that are true in the way that fiction is true, which is the way that is different from, but not less than, the way that historical documentation is true. Some of this work is less honest about what it is, or less careful about the distinction between the documented and the elaborated, between the historical Yasuke and the Yasuke that the specific and various needs of the modern imagination have produced from the historical foundation. This work is worth engaging with carefully and without contempt, because the needs that produce it are real needs, and the imagination that produced it is a genuine imagination, and the Yasuke it has produced is a genuine cultural phenomenon, even when it is not a reliable historical account. The boundary between the historical and the legendary is not a judgment about the value of the legendary. It is simply a description of where the evidence ends and the imagination begins. A description that honest engagement with a life this unusual requires making and maintaining, without using the maintenance as a reason to diminish either the historical figure or the cultural phenomenon that has grown from the historical figure's documented and undocumented life. He was real. This is the foundation. He was extraordinary. This is what the evidence establishes. He was more than what the evidence preserves. This is what the silence tells us. And the silence, read honestly, is not the absence of a story. It is the presence of one that we have not yet found the words for. Shh. Just breathe. The records are quiet around you. The boundary between the documented and the undocumented runs through the middle of the room like a line drawn in water, visible for a moment and then gone, present in the shape of what is on either side of it, rather than in any marking of the line itself. On one side, the extraordinary facts. On the other, the interior that the facts were organized around. And somewhere between the two, a person, real and complete, and only partially preserved, as all of us are, only partially preserved. Good night. The concept of race, in the specific and modern sense of the word, did not exist in 16th century Japan. This statement requires some care, because it is the kind of statement that is true in an important way, and that is also capable of being misread in ways that make it less true than it is, that convert a precise and useful historical observation into a comfortable and potentially misleading oversimplification. The care it requires is this. The absence of the modern concept of race does not mean the absence of the awareness of difference, does not mean that the people of Sengoku Japan looked at Yasuke and processed what they saw through a framework that was entirely indifferent to the specific and various ways in which he was different from them, does not mean that the categories of the foreign and the outside and the not Japanese were not present and not operative in how the world he moved through encountered and understood his presence. What it means is something more precise and more interesting than the simple absence of prejudice, which would be a comfortable conclusion, but not an accurate one. It means that the framework through which the difference was understood was organized around different axes than the framework that the modern world uses, was organized around the axes of the foreigner and the familiar, and the inside and the outside, and the specific and various categories of status and function and relationship to power that the Sengoku world used to sort the people within it into the configurations that the world required, rather than around the axis of skin color as the primary and organizing determinant of a person's position in the human hierarchy. Skin color was visible, obviously and immediately, and to everyone who saw him. Skin color was the first and most overwhelming fact of Yasuke's physical presence in Japan. The fact that produced the crowd at Sakai and the examination at Azuchi, and the specific and various responses that the accounts describe across every context in which his presence is recorded. But visible is not the same as determinative, and the visibility of a difference does not automatically produce from that visibility the specific and modern conclusion that the difference is the kind that organizes people into hierarchies of fundamental worth, that places the person with the different skin on one side of a moral and social boundary, whose existence and whose location are determined by the color itself. The Sengoku world had its own hierarchies. They were real, and they were consequential, and they were not kind to the people at their lower ends. But they were organized around different principles than the hierarchies that the modern world inherited from the specific and historical process of European colonial expansion, and the specific and constructed ideology that the expansion required to justify itself. The ideology that took the visible fact of physical difference and converted it into the foundational and determinative fact of human worth. Yasuke walked into a world that had not yet made this conversion. What that meant for the specific and daily quality of his life in Japan is the question that this chapter is organized around. The question that is harder to answer than the question of what the concept of race is and is not in this period. Harder because it requires not the intellectual exercise of historical comparison, but the specific and imaginative engagement with what it felt like, from the inside, to be this person in this world at this time. The foreigners that Japan had encountered before Yasuke arrived are worth thinking about, because they are the context within which his presence was received, the prior experience that the Japanese world brought to the encounter with him, and that shaped, however approximately and however incompletely, the categories that the world was able to apply to what it was seeing. The Chinese and the Koreans were the primary foreigners in the Japanese experience of this period, the people from the continent whose presence in Japan, through trade and cultural exchange, and the specific and various forms of contact that proximity across water produces over centuries, had created in the Japanese world a set of understandings and relationships and categories for the foreign that were organized around the specific and concrete reality of these particular foreigners and their particular cultures and their particular relationships to Japan. These understandings were not always generous and not always accurate, were organized around the specific and various interests and concerns and historical experiences that shaped how Japan understood its neighbors. But they were understandings built from sustained contact, from the accumulated experience of generations of encounter, from the specific and various deposits of knowledge and misunderstanding and relationship that long acquaintance between peoples produces. The Europeans were newer. The Portuguese have been arriving in Japan since the 1540s, and in the decades between their first arrival and Yasuke's appearance in Sakai harbor, the Japanese world had been developing from the specific and accelerating experience of contact with these particular foreigners, a set of understandings and categories for the European that were still in the early stages of formation, still organized more around the immediate and vivid impressions of direct encounter than around the accumulated and settled understanding that long acquaintance produces. The Europeans were strange in the specific and various ways that the accounts of Japanese responses to early European contact record. Strange in their appearance and their smell and their food and their religion and their specific and unusual combination of technological sophistication and cultural confidence that the Japanese found simultaneously impressive and slightly difficult to account for within the frameworks available for understanding visitors from outside the world. The frameworks were built to describe. Yasuke was stranger than either. Not stranger in a way that the Japanese world had no resources for receiving, because the Japanese world had resources for receiving the strange that were more various and more flexible than the simple binary of the familiar and the incomprehensible. The tradition of the Buddhist and Shinto cosmologies that organized the Japanese understanding of the world was a tradition comfortable with the existence of beings and forces and presences that were outside the ordinary categories of human experience, that had developed over centuries the specific and various vocabulary for the extraordinary and the uncategorizable that a cosmological tradition requires if it is going to be honest about the full range of what the world contains. He was outside the ordinary categories. But outside the ordinary categories was not, in this tradition, the same as outside the moral community, was not the same as beneath the consideration of the people whose categories he exceeded, was not the automatic trigger for the specific and dehumanizing response that the modern framework of race produces when it encounters the person who exceeds its categories. He was extraordinary, and extraordinary in this world was something that the world had frameworks for receiving, however imperfectly, however approximately. What Yasuke saw when he looked at Japan is the question that the sources cannot answer, and that the imagination must approach with the specific and careful quality of an engagement that knows it is imagining rather than reporting, that holds the imagining lightly enough to be honest about its own speculative nature, while still being willing to do the work of imagining that the life deserves. He saw a country at war with itself. This is the first and most basic thing, the thing that was most immediately and most visibly present in every dimension of the Japan he moved through, the specific and pervasive quality of a society that has been organized around the fact of internal military conflict for long enough that the conflict has become one of the primary organizing conditions of the society, rather than an interruption of the society's ordinary functioning. The landscape he moved through, from the harbor at Sakai to the castle at Azuchi to the streets of Kyoto, was a landscape that bore in every element of its built environment and its social organization, and its specific and various textures of daily life, the marks of a world that was simultaneously constructing and destroying itself, that was building castles and burning temples, and negotiating truces and breaking them, and doing all of these things simultaneously, in the specific and exhausting way of a society that has not yet arrived at the resolution that will allow it to be something other than a society at war with itself. He saw extraordinary beauty. This is the second thing, the thing that the accounts of Japan in this period preserve with a consistency and a quality of attention that suggests it was genuinely present and genuinely striking to the people who encountered it. The specific and various beauty of a country that had been developing its aesthetic traditions for centuries, and that expressed those traditions in every dimension of the physical environment, from the architecture of the castles and the temples to the gardens that surrounded them, to the specific and elaborate material culture of the warrior class, whose relationship to beauty was not a contradiction of their relationship to violence, but an expression of the same underlying sensibility, the sensibility that found in the precise and deliberate and completely realized form of things, whether the things were swords or tea bowls, or the arrangement of stones in a garden, the specific and sustaining quality of the world, organized according to a principle that was not merely functional, but genuinely meaningful. He saw Nobunaga whole. This is the third thing, the thing that no other person in the historical record saw in quite the way that Yasuke saw it, because no other person in the historical record occupied the specific and unprecedented position that Yasuke occupied in relation to Nobunaga, the position of the person who was present continuously and intimately across the full range of the situations that the Lord moved through. who saw the public Nobunaga and the private Nobunaga, and the various positions between these two that the daily and various life of the most powerful man in Japan required him to occupy. The Nobunaga that Yasuke saw was the Nobunaga that no Japanese person could see in quite the same way, because the Japanese people who were close to Nobunaga saw him through the specific and various frameworks of their own cultural position, saw him as lord, as patron, as military commander, as the specific and various things that their own relationship to the Japanese hierarchy required them to see him as. Yasuke saw him through a different framework, or through the absence of the framework that all of his Japanese contemporaries were operating within. And the seeing that the absence of the framework produced was not necessarily more accurate, but it was differently positioned, was organized around different axes, was capable of perceiving dimensions of the man that the available Japanese frameworks were not organized to perceive. What he made of what he saw is the question that the silence does not answer. The daily texture of Yasuke's life in Japan is not something that the sources preserve with the specificity that the texture of a life requires to be fully understood. But the texture can be approached through the specific and careful engagement with what the sources do preserve, and what can be reasonably inferred from the conditions that the sources establish. He ate Japanese food. This seems like a small thing, and it is not a small thing, is one of the most basic and most daily of the specific and various adjustments that a life in a completely foreign culture requires. One of the adjustments that happens so continuously and so unremarkably that it rarely makes its way into the correspondence and the accounts that preserve the more dramatic elements of the life, but that is present in every day, multiple times every day, as the specific and immediate reality of a body that is being sustained by a cuisine that is organized around entirely different ingredients and entirely different preparations and entirely different flavor principles than the cuisine the body was built on. He learnt to communicate in Japanese. The accounts establish this with enough specificity to treat it as a fact rather than an inference, and the fact of language acquisition is one of the most significant facts the accounts preserve about the interior adjustment that the life in Japan required. Because learning a language is not only the acquisition of a communication tool, but the acquisition, partial and gradual, and never entirely complete, but real and accumulating, of the framework that the language carries within it. The specific and various ways that Japanese organizes experience into communicable form. The categories and the relationships between categories, and the specific and consequential distinctions that the language makes, and that the body of the person learning it gradually internalizes without always being aware of the internalization. He navigated hierarchy. The specific and elaborate hierarchy of the Sengoku warrior world was the water he swam in for the years of his life in Nobunaga's service, the organizing condition of every social interaction and every public movement and every encounter with the various people that the life in the inner circle brought him into contact with. He navigated this hierarchy from the specific and unprecedented position of a person who was simultaneously within it, by virtue of the sword and the room and the name and the proximity to the Lord, and outside it, by virtue of everything else, by virtue of the fact that the hierarchy was not built to include him and had no established place for him, and was therefore required to improvise the place it gave him in the way that hierarchies improvise when the person they are required to accommodate does not fit the existing categories. The improvisation was not always comfortable, and it was not always kind, and it was also not, in the specific and honest record of what the accounts preserve, organized around the kind of systematic exclusion that would have made his position in the court untenable, or his presence in the inner circle impossible. The hierarchy improvised a place for him because the Lord required it to improvise a place for him, and the Lord's requirement was sufficient in the world of Sengoku Japan to produce the improvisation. Because in the world of Sengoku Japan, the Lord's requirement was the most powerful organizing force available, and the hierarchies that the Lord required to adjusted, however imperfectly and however provisionally. He lived in this imperfect and provisional adjustment for the years of his life in Japan's inner circle. And the living produced in him, or continued in him, or confirmed in him, the specific and grounded quality that the accounts consistently describe as his most characteristic quality, the quality of being entirely present for the life he was living, without organizing himself around the extraordinary quality of the life he was living, of moving through the unprecedented situation with the bearing of a person who has accepted the situation's unprecedented quality as simply the condition of the life, rather than as something that requires ongoing management or performance. The Japan that Yasuke walked through was a Japan that was in the process of becoming something it had not been before, and he was part of the process, was one of the specific and various elements of the new and the foreign and the unprecedented that the process of becoming was incorporating into itself, not smoothly and not without friction, but genuinely, in the specific and various ways that a society in transformation incorporates the things that its transformation brings into contact with. He walked through the markets of Kyoto, where the specific and various commerce of a city that was the cultural center of the country was conducted with the energy of a place that was simultaneously recovering from destruction and asserting the vitality that made it worth recovering. He walked through the corridors of Azuchi Castle, where the business of the unification was conducted in the specific and indirect way that business of this kind is conducted in formal settings, where the decisions that would determine the lives of millions of people were being made by the people who had the proximity to the decision maker that proximity to power provides. He walked through the camps and the roads of a country that was always, in this period, somewhere between one military arrangement and the next, where the specific and various textures of a society organized around the possibility of violence were present in every element of the built and social environment. He walked through all of this with the bearing that the accounts describe. The bearing is the thing that connects every account of him, the single most consistent element across all of the surviving descriptions, the specific and recognizable quality that appears in the description of him at Sakai and at Azuchi and in the streets of Kyoto and in the burning temple, and that is present enough and consistent enough to constitute something like a portrait of the person beneath the extraordinary facts of the life. A portrait not of the face or the body, but of the quality of the presence, the specific and unelaborated quality of a person who is entirely where they are. This quality, in the world he walked through, was not unremarkable. It was, in the specific and various contexts that the life placed him in, one of the most remarkable things about him. More remarkable in some ways than the physical facts of his presence that produced the crowds and the examinations, and the specific and various responses that the extraordinary surface of his appearance generated. Because the physical facts were outside the available categories, and therefore required the world to construct new categories for them, but the quality of the presence was inside the available categories, was the kind of thing that the warrior tradition of Sengoku Japan had very precise and very well developed categories for. Categories that organized the assessment of a person's bearing and presence, and the specific and grounded quality of their engagement with the situations they moved through with the specific and professional precision of a culture that had been making this assessment for a very long time, and that knew what it was looking for. What it was looking for was this: the quality of a person who is completely here. And what it found in the man from the other side of the world who had crossed an ocean and walked into the most extraordinary circumstances available in the most extraordinary country in the world at the most extraordinary moment in that country's history was exactly that. Shh. Just breathe. The world he walked through is quiet now. The markets and the corridors and the roads and the camps are still, the way things are still when they have become history, when the specific and various noise of their living has been replaced by the specific and various silence of their having lived. But somewhere in the stillness, if you listen with the specific and careful quality of attention that the stillness requires, you can hear footsteps, moving through it, completely present, entirely here. Good night. The man who disappeared from the historical record in the summer of 1582 reappeared in the global imagination in the summer of 2024. And the reappearance had a quality that the original arrival in Japan 4.5 centuries earlier would have recognized, which is to say, it had the quality of a crowd, of a very large number of people encountering something that their existing categories could not entirely account for, and responding with the specific and various combination of fascination and uncertainty, and the particular quality of sustained attention that extraordinary things generate in people who are not sure what they are feeling or what the feeling means. The occasion was a video game, Assassin's Creed Shadows, the installment of the long-running historical action franchise set in late 16th century Japan, announced in 2024 that one of its 2 playable protagonists would be Yasuke, the African warrior in Nobunaga's service, the man whose documented life had been known to historians and to the specialist communities of people who follow Japanese history seriously, but who had not, before this announcement, achieved the specific and global quality of recognition that the game's announcement produced almost instantly. The quality of a name that moves in a single news cycle from the specialist community into the general consciousness, and arrives there with the weight of something that the general consciousness immediately senses is significant, without always knowing exactly why. The response was large, and it was various, and it was, in the specific and honest way of responses to things that touch something real and contested in the culture that produces them, not entirely comfortable. Some of the response was celebration. The celebration had the quality of people who had been waiting for exactly this, who had known about Yasuke for years, and who found in the game's announcement the specific and satisfying quality of a recognition that had been deserved for a long time finally arriving. The recognition that the extraordinary life of an extraordinary person deserved the kind of cultural attention that the game's global platform could provide, deserved to be known by the hundreds of millions of people who would encounter it through the game in a way that the specialist historical literature could never have reached them. Some of the response was controversy. The controversy had the quality of a disagreement that was simultaneously about the specific historical questions that the game raised and about something larger and less specific, something that the historical questions were standing in for, something that the specific and various people participating in the controversy were not always fully articulating, but that was present in the heat of the disagreement, in the specific and elevated quality of the feeling that the disagreement generated. The feeling that is the reliable indicator that the thing being argued about is not only the thing being argued about, the man from the other side of the world who walked through 16th century Japan with the bearing of a person who was entirely where he was, had become, 4.5 centuries after the records went quiet, the center of one of the most heated cultural conversations in the global gaming community. He would have found this extraordinary, though perhaps not entirely surprising. The historical controversy that the game announcement generated is worth examining with the specific and careful attention that controversies about historical figures deserve, when the controversies are simultaneously about history and about something else. When the historical questions are real, and the something else is also real, and the two dimensions of the controversy are entangled in ways that make it difficult to address either dimension without the other dimension being present in the addressing. The historical dimension of the controversy was this: how significant was Yasuke really? The documented facts of his life in Nobunaga's service, the facts that this chapter and the chapters preceding it have been examining with the specific and careful attention that the evidence deserves, were interpreted by different people in significantly different ways that produced significantly different conclusions about what those facts mean and what kind of cultural recognition the life they describe deserves. On one side of this interpretation were the people who found in the documented facts the specific and extraordinary life that this telling has been presenting. The life of a man who crossed an ocean and walked into the most powerful court in Japan, and was given a name and a sword and a proximity to power that no foreigner had been given before, who fought in the burning temple for the Lord who gave him all of these things, and who walked out of the smoke into the silence that the records have been keeping ever since. This interpretation found the documented facts sufficient to establish that the life was extraordinary by any honest measure, and that the cultural recognition the life deserved was the kind of recognition that the game's announcement was providing. On the other side were the people who found in the documented facts a more modest story, who argued that the specific and various claims being made about Yasuke's significance were larger than the evidence supported, that the gap between what the sources actually say and what the cultural moment was making of what the sources say was large enough to constitute a distortion rather than an elaboration, that the Yasuke being presented to the global gaming audience was a legend that had grown beyond the historical figure in ways that required acknowledgement rather than celebration. Both sides of this interpretation had access to the same evidence. The difference between them was not primarily a difference in what they knew about the evidence, but a difference in what they brought to the evidence, in the specific and various frameworks and concerns and prior commitments that shaped how they read what the evidence said and what they concluded from it. This is the normal condition of historical interpretation, the condition that makes history a discipline that produces ongoing conversation rather than settled conclusions. And it is not a condition that should be used to dismiss either side of the conversation, or to pretend that the conversation is simply a matter of good faith disagreement between equally positioned interpreters. Because it was not only that. The heat of the controversy, the specific and elevated quality of the feeling that the disagreement generated, was not entirely produced by the historical questions. It was produced by the historical questions and by the something else. And the something else was present in the room with the historical questions at every moment of the controversy, shaping the temperature of the exchange in ways that made the historical questions feel, to the people inside the controversy, more urgent and more consequential than purely historical questions usually feel. The something else is worth naming directly. Because the honest engagement with the Yasuke story in the 21st century requires the honest engagement with the reasons the story matters to the people it matters to, in the specific ways it matters to them. Requires the acknowledgement that a story about a man of African origin in a position of extraordinary distinction in a 16th century Japanese court is not, in the cultural context of the 21st century, a story that exists in a neutral space, a space where the historical questions can be examined without the weight of everything that has happened in the world between the 16th century and the present moment pressing on the examination. The weight is real. 4.5 centuries of history press on the story of Yasuke in the specific and various ways that the history of the African diaspora and the Atlantic slave trade and European colonialism and the specific and long and not yet concluded process of the world reckoning with what that history did and what it produced and what it still produces press on every story about a person of African origin that the present moment tells, shapes how the story is received and what it means to the people who receive it, and what is at stake in the telling and in the controversy about the telling. The people who celebrated the game's announcement were not only celebrating the historical Yasuke, they were celebrating the specific and powerful fact of a man of African origin in a position of extraordinary distinction, being given the kind of cultural recognition that the global gaming industry's most prominent historical franchise could provide. The recognition that says, this life matters. This person was real and significant and deserving of the attention that the cultural apparatus of the present gives to the lives it considers worth knowing about. This is not a small thing, and it is not separate from the historical question of Yasuke's significance, is entangled with it in the specific and honest way that the present is always entangled with the past, when the past is a past that the present is still living inside of. The people who pushed back on the game's claims were not only doing historical scholarship. Some of them were, genuinely and in good faith, raising the specific and legitimate questions about historical accuracy that the representation of historical figures in popular culture always raises, and that always deserve to be raised honestly. And some of them were doing something else, were using the language of historical accuracy to address concerns that were not primarily historical, were organizing the energy of their objection around something other than the purely scholarly commitment to the accurate representation of the past that the language of their objection was claiming. The controversy was about Yasuke, and it was about what Yasuke represents, and it was about what the present moment does with the past, when the past is a past that the present has strong feelings about. And it was about who gets to tell which stories, and who gets to decide what the stories mean. And it was about all of the specific and various things that the present moment brings to its encounters with the past, when the past and the present are connected by the specific and unresolved weight of history that connects them. He would have found this extraordinary too. This man who walked through a world that had not yet made the specific and destructive conversion that the modern world inherited, who was seen by the most powerful man in Japan as something worth engaging with on its own terms, rather than within the framework of what it was supposed to be, who was given a name and a sword and a proximity to power not because of the category he fit into, but because of the specific and direct evidence of what he was. He became, 4.5 centuries later, the center of a controversy about exactly the question that his life was spent outside of, the question of what the category requires. The Netflix animated series that bears his name arrived in 2021, and did what animated series do when they take historical figures as their subjects, which is to say, it took the documented skeleton of the historical life and built from it a story organized around the requirements of the medium and the audience, rather than around the requirements of historical accuracy. A story that used the historical foundation as an anchor and the historical silences as the space in which the imagination could construct the specific and various elaborations that the medium and the audience required. The series is not history. It announces itself as not history, presents itself as the imaginative engagement with a historical figure's undocumented life, rather than as the accurate representation of the documented life. And this honesty about what it is doing is worth acknowledging and worth respecting, because it is the honesty that allows the work to be assessed on its own terms, rather than on the terms of historical documentation that it was not trying to meet. It introduced Yasuke to an audience that had not encountered him before, an audience that came to the historical figure through the fictional version rather than through the historical sources, that received the name and the basic facts of the life through the medium of a story that was organized around different concerns than the concerns of historical scholarship. This introduction is not without value, is not a distortion that leaves the audience worse off than they would have been without the introduction. Because the audience that was introduced to Yasuke through the animated series was an audience that now knew the name, that now had a reason to ask the historical questions that the series was not answering, that now had the specific and motivating quality of a prior engagement with a story that made the historical version of the story interesting in a way it would not have been interesting without the prior engagement. The game arrived 3 years later with a larger platform and a louder announcement, and the specific and combustible combination of a property beloved by many and a historical claim contested by some, and a cultural moment organized around exactly the questions that the claim and the contest were touching. And the combustion was what combustion always is, which is the specific and energetic release of something that was already present, and that the particular combination of elements brought to the ignition point. The historical Yasuke was in the middle of all of this, patient as historical figures are patient when the present is arguing about them, which is to say, entirely uninvolved, entirely beyond the reach of the argument, entirely located in the specific and permanent past that the living carry forward as foundation, without always knowing what they are carrying or why. He could not tell the present what he was. He had left that to the record. And the record, as this telling has been at pains to establish, is partial. Which means the present is, in some important sense, on its own. The legend that has grown around Yasuke is not a betrayal of the historical figure. This is the conclusion that the honest engagement with both the historical record and the cultural phenomenon produces. The conclusion that holds both the historical and the legendary with the specific and careful attention that each deserves, without using the claims of the one to diminish the value of the other. The historical Yasuke is extraordinary. This is what the evidence establishes, and what the careful examination of the evidence confirms, and what the honest telling of the story that the evidence supports produces in the people who receive it. The specific and grounded quality of encountering something that was real and significant and deserving of the attention that the present is giving it, even when the attention is imperfect, and even when the forms it takes are not always organized around the historical accuracy that the historical figure deserves. The legendary Yasuke is also real, in the specific and important way that legends are real, which is the way of cultural phenomena whose existence and whose effects are as concrete and as consequential as the existence and effects of historical facts that shape what people believe and what people value and what people find worth telling and worth knowing in ways that historical facts, whose existence is established but whose cultural presence is minimal, cannot shape. The legend that has grown around Yasuke has produced a global awareness of a historical figure who would otherwise be known only to the specialist community, has created the specific and motivating quality of prior engagement that sends people to the historical sources, has placed in the global imagination the specific and powerful fact of a man of African origin in a position of extraordinary distinction in 16th century Japan, and asked the global imagination to sit with what that fact means. This is not nothing. This is, in some respects, everything. The boundary between the historical and the legendary is real, and it is worth maintaining with the care that honest engagement with history requires. Worth maintaining not as a wall that separates two incompatible things, but as a line that allows two real and valuable things to be seen clearly in their own right, to be assessed and appreciated for what they actually are, rather than for what either side of the controversy needs them to be. The man who arrived in Sakai harbour in 1579 and crossed an ocean and walked into the most powerful court in Japan and was given a name and a sword and a proximity to power that no foreigner had been given before was real. His life was extraordinary by any honest measure. The silence that surrounds the later part of that life is a silence that the historical record produced and that the historical record cannot fill. And the legend that has grown in the silence is the specific and human response to a story that the silence made available for the imagination to inhabit. The response that the human relationship to significant stories always produces when the significant story has gaps large enough to invite the imagination in. He crossed an ocean to get here, and 4.5 centuries later, the world is still crossing oceans to find him, still pressing against the gates, still trying to see. Shh, just breathe. The controversy is quiet now. The crowd has not dispersed, but has stilled, the way crowds still when the thing they came to see has moved past the first overwhelming quality of its arrival into something more settled and more present, and more available to the specific and careful attention that extraordinary things deserve when the extraordinary quality has been absorbed enough to allow the attention to be directed at the thing itself, rather than at the response to the thing. Somewhere in the stillness, past the games and the series and the controversy and the celebration and the counter-argument and the specific and various things that the present has made of the past, there is a man, real and partial and only approximately preserved, waiting for the attention that is honest enough to sit with both what the record gives and what the record withholds, without needing the silence to be something other than what it is. Good night. There is a specific kind of historical figure who is defined as much by what we cannot know about them as by what we can, whose significance lives not only in the documented facts of the life, but in the specific and weighted quality of the gaps between the facts, in the silences that the record produces and that the imagination inhabits, and that the honest engagement with the life must hold without filling, must sit with without resolving into the comfort of a conclusion that the evidence does not support. Yasuke is this kind of figure. He is this kind of figure not because the gaps in the record are unusual, because gaps in the record are the normal condition of historical evidence, and the people who do not appear in the surviving sources are not extraordinary absences, but the overwhelming majority of the human beings who have ever lived, the people whose lives were real and consequential and entirely unrecorded, and who constitute the vast and silent foundation on which the thin and partial layer of the documented past rests. He is this kind of figure because the gaps in his record are so precisely located, so exactly positioned at the moments when the life is most significant and the questions most worth asking, that the gaps feel like something more than the ordinary incompleteness of historical documentation, feel like the specific and almost deliberate withholding of the information that the story most requires. The record gives us the extraordinary surface and withholds the interior. It gives us the crowd at Sakai, and the examination at Azuchi, and the sword, and the name, and the room near the Lord's quarters, and the circle of power, and the burning temple, and the walk through the smoke. It gives us the facts of a life so extraordinary that the facts alone, without the interior that the facts were organized around, without the specific and various quality of the experience of being the person who lived the facts, are sufficient to establish the life as one of the most remarkable in the history of the period. And then it goes quiet. At the moment when the life has arrived at its most consequential point, when the world that the life was built inside has burned, and the question of what comes next is the most important and the most unanswerable question the life has produced, the record closes with the specific and final quality of a door shutting in a corridor that continues beyond the door, that continues in the dark and the silence, beyond the reach of what the record can see. We are left with the facts and the silence, and the question of what the facts and the silence together mean. The meaning is what this chapter is about. What do we actually know? This is the question that the honest engagement with Yasuke eventually arrives at. The question that the careful examination of the evidence produces when the examination has been done with sufficient care to distinguish between what the sources actually say and what the people who have been telling the story have added to what the sources say. Between the documented fact and the reasonable inference and the imaginative elaboration and the wishful conclusion that the story's power tends to generate in the people who tell it. We know that a man of African origin arrived in Japan in 1579 in the company of the Jesuit missionary Alessandro Valignano, and that his arrival in the harbour at Sakai produced a response of extraordinary scale. A crowd of thousands pressing so hard against the gates that men were injured in the pressing. A response that the Jesuit accounts describe with the specific and attentive quality of writers who understood that what they were witnessing was significant. We know that Oda Nobunaga summoned him, examined him, and decided to keep him. We know that the keeping was organized around the specific and unprecedented forms of the naming and the sword and the room near the Lord's quarters that together constituted, within the framework of Nobunaga's court, a statement about Yasuke's position in the inner circle that the court understood and responded to with the specific and various quality of an institution processing something outside its available categories. We know that he was present at Honnoji on the night of the 21st day of the 6th month of 1582. We know that he fought, or was present for the fighting, and that he walked out of the burning temple and was captured by the forces of Akechi Mitsuhide, and was delivered to the Jesuit residence rather than killed, and that Mitsuhide's reported reasoning for the delivery rather than the killing was the specific and convenient determination that Yasuke was not the kind of thing that the decisions of the night applied to. We know that the Jesuit accounts describe him in the residence in the weeks after Honnoji with the word sad. We know that the record stops. This is what we know. It is not nothing. It is, in the specific and honest assessment of what the evidence provides, quite a lot. enough to establish the outline of a life that was extraordinary by any measure, and that deserves the attention that the present is giving it, and more. And it is not enough. It is not enough to answer the questions that the outline raises, the questions about the interior, about what the life felt like from the inside, about what Yasuke made of the world he walked through, and what the world made of him, and what happened after the gate of the Jesuit residence closed behind him, and the record lost track, and the life continued in the dark. These questions are real, and the honest answer to them is that we do not know. The not knowing is not a failure. This is the thing about the silence that this chapter has been building toward. The thing that the careful examination of the evidence and the honest acknowledgement of its limits produces when the examination and the acknowledgement have been done with the specific and patient quality that they require. The not knowing is not a failure of the scholarship, or a failure of the historical record, or a failure of the people who have been trying to tell the story honestly. It is simply the condition of the evidence, the specific and honest condition of a life that was documented by people who were not documenting it for the reasons that would have produced the documentation we now need, who were documenting it for their own reasons, and who produced, in the service of their own reasons, a record that is real and valuable and genuinely informative and also genuinely partial. The partiality is not a judgment on the life. This is the second thing that the not knowing requires saying clearly, because the partiality of the record is sometimes received as a judgment, as if the incompleteness of the documentation reflects the incompleteness of the significance, as if the life that the record does not fully preserve was a life that was not fully worth preserving. This reception is wrong in the specific and important way that confusions between the record and the reality are always wrong, which is the way that mistakes the map for the territory, that treats the documentation of a thing as the measure of the thing, rather than as the imperfect and partial representation of a thing that exists independently of its documentation. The life was complete. This is the thing that the not knowing cannot take away, the thing that the silence cannot diminish, the thing that is true about Yasuke's life, regardless of how much or how little the record preserves of it. The life was complete in the way that all lives are complete, in the specific and irreducible way of a person being present in the world for the time that the world gave them, and experiencing that time with the full weight of being alive, being conscious, having an interior that the exterior was organized around, having the specific and various quality of a person who is here, entirely and completely here, in the only way that here is possible, which is from the inside. The record gives us the outside. The inside was always his, and the inside was real, even when the record was not present to document it, was real in the burning temple, and in the streets of Kyoto, and in the harbor at Sakai, and in the room in the Jesuit residence where the accounts describe him as sad, was real in the years and the decades that may have followed the record's closing, in the undocumented continuation of a life that did not end when the documentation ended. The not knowing is the honest condition of the evidence. And the honest condition of the evidence is not an obstacle to telling the story. It is part of the story. What did he leave behind? This is the question that the final chapter of A Life asks. The question that Musashi answered with a book written in a cave, and paintings that are still held, and sculptures that are still touched, and a garden that is still tended, and a philosophy that people 500 years later carry into boardrooms and onto training floors and into the quiet corners of their lives, where they are trying to figure out what it means to do something with complete and total seriousness. Yasuke's answer is different. He left behind a silence that speaks. This is the specific and paradoxical quality of what the life produced in the long run. The specific and weighted quality of a silence that is not the silence of something that was never there, but the silence of something that was fully there, and that the record lost, and that the losing of has become, in the centuries since the losing, one of the most honest and most consequential absences in the historical record of this period. The silence speaks because it is shaped, because it has the specific contours of a life that was present, and that left those contours in the record, even when the record stopped following the life that made them. Because the shape of what is missing is itself a kind of presence, a kind of evidence, a kind of statement about what was there. He left behind a question that the present is still asking. The question of what a person of African origin in a position of extraordinary distinction in 16th century Japan means. What it tells us about the world that produced the situation and the person who inhabited the situation, and the record that preserved some of the situation and lost the rest. This question is alive in the present, in a way that questions about historical figures are alive when the historical figure and the present moment are connected by something more than academic interest. When the life touches something in the present that the present is still working through. He left behind a name, Yasuke, the name that Nobunaga gave him, the name that the Jesuit accounts preserved, the name that the centuries of silence did not entirely erase, the name that the novels and the films and the games and the animated series have carried into the global imagination of the 21st century, with the specific and imperfect and genuinely valuable quality of cultural transmission that is not the same as historical preservation, but that is also not nothing, that keeps the name present in the world, in the way that names stay present when the world finds reasons to keep saying them. The name survived the silence, and the name is, in some important sense, what he left behind. The specific and minimal and entirely sufficient fact of a name that the present keeps returning to, that the present keeps finding reasons to say, that the present cannot quite leave alone, because the life attached to the name is the kind of life that the present cannot afford to leave alone, that touches something in the present that the present needs to keep touching, that asks a question that the present is not finished asking. He crossed an ocean with nothing but himself, and what he left behind is the specific and permanent fact of having been here, which is everything. The ship came into Sakai harbour on a day in 1579, and the harbour was not ready for him, and the city was not ready for him, and the country was not ready for him, and the history that would eventually be written about him was not ready for him. And none of this unreadiness prevented the arrival. None of it changed the specific and irreducible fact of the man stepping off the ship onto the soil of Japan for the first time, and the soil receiving him the way the soil receives everyone, which is to say, without ceremony, and without the kind of environmental acknowledgement that the significance of the arrival seems to require, with the specific and complete indifference of a world that has no investment in the significance of what is happening, but that is simply here, solid and various and entirely real, available to be walked on by whoever steps onto it. He walked on it for 3 years, and perhaps more, for the documented 3 years and the undocumented years beyond the documentation. And the walking was real, and the years were real, and the life was real in all of its specific and various and partially preserved and largely unknown dimensions. Real in the harbour and the castle and the circle of power and the burning temple and the room in the Jesuit residence and the street outside the gate and the whatever came after the street outside the gate that the record does not follow and that the life continued into, regardless of whether the record was following or not. We will never fully know him. This is the honest conclusion. The conclusion that the careful examination of the evidence and the honest acknowledgement of its limits and the specific and patient engagement with both what the record gives and what the record withholds produces, when the examination and the acknowledgement and the engagement have been done with the quality of attention that a life this extraordinary deserves. We will never fully know him the way we know people whose interior lives are documented, whose letters and diaries and spoken words have been preserved in forms that give the people who come after some access to the specific and various quality of the experience of being that person in that time, in that place. But we know that he was here, and we know what here was, and we know what it meant to be here the way he was here, which is to say, in a position that no one had occupied before, and that no one has occupied in quite the same way since, in the specific and unprecedented intersection of an extraordinary person and an extraordinary time and an extraordinary set of circumstances that produced the specific and extraordinary life that the record partially preserved and the silence partially concealed and the present keeps returning to, because the returning is honest, because the life deserves the returning, because the man who crossed an ocean and walked into the most powerful court in Japan and was given a name and a sword and a proximity to power that no foreigner had been given before, and who fought in the burning temple for the man who gave him all of these things, and who walked into the silence of the historical record with the bearing that every account of him describes, the bearing of a person who is entirely where they are. That man was real. The reality does not require the full documentation to be real. It requires only the honest acknowledgement that it was there, completely and specifically, and in the only way that reality is ever there, which is in the specific and irreducible fact of a person being present in the world and moving through it, and being changed by it, and changing it in ways too large to be captured by the record, and too small to be noticed by it, and everywhere in between, in all the specific and various and undocumented ways that a life is a life, rather than a record of a life. He was more than the record. He was always more than the record. All of us are. Shh. Just breathe. The harbour is quiet. The strait between Honshu and Kyushu is doing what straits do, moving with the specific and patient quality of water that has been moving through this particular geography since before the human world began, and will continue moving after the human world has become something else entirely, indifferent and clean, and carrying nothing on its surface except the light. Somewhere on the other side of the water, somewhere on the other side of 4.5 centuries, a man stepped off a ship, and the world was not ready. and he was entirely here. And the being entirely here was enough. It was always enough. It will always be enough. Shh. Rest now. The morning tide carries everything forward. The name survives the silence, as it always has, as it always will. Yasuke. Good night.